The Navy, I think, who have done so much for us, have at least an equal claim with any other set of men, for all the comforts and all the privileges which any home can give. Sailors work hard enough for their comforts, we must all allow. Very true, very true. What Miss Anne says is very true, was Mr. Shepherd's rejoinder, and oh, certainly, was the daughter's. But Sir Walter's remark was soon afterwards. The profession has its utility, but I should be sorry to see any friend of mine belonging to it. Welcome to Positive Read-Ins. Support this channel and discover new literature by getting your copy of Commutin. You can link to it in the description. You can also link to the Gymnasia Press website, where you can get a copy of the short story collection Comorbidities and the original novel Non-Local. Thank you. The beginning reading came from Jane Austen's final novel, Persuasion. This was published posthumously in 1818. I can't say that this novel was a great pleasure to read. However, there were instances throughout that I thought were interesting, partly or mostly for the sociological perspective it gives for the culture of the time. But also, of course, there's great writing throughout. I found this novel more engaging and more interesting than Pride and Prejudice, not only because it's shorter, but the character is a bit more complex. The main character, the protagonist, Anne Elliot, and she's different from Jane Austen's other heroines. This Anne here is older. It's still a love story, like all the novels, in a story about manners and how to behave. But Anne is an older woman. She's, I think, 28, getting close to 30. Not quite an old maid, but for the time, perhaps. The premise of the novel is Anne was engaged to Frederick Wentworth 10 years previously. Anne's friend talked her out of this engagement. They broke it off. Wentworth went away, joined the Navy. This is the historical context is the Napoleonic Wars, and Wentworth became a wealthy from this. And he comes back, and he's handsome as ever, and he has money, and Anne wants him back. To give you a little, I guess, insight into this, after they first meet, she's talking to a friend, Mary, and she says, "Captain Wentworth is not very gallant by you, Anne, though he was so attentive to me. Henrietta asked him what he thought of you when they went away, and he said you were so altered he should not have known you again." So Anne takes this comment about her being so altered as being negative, right? She says, "Altered beyond his knowledge," and fully submitted in silent, deep mortification. Doubtless it was so, and she could take no revenge, for he was not altered, or not for the worse. She had already acknowledged it to herself, and she could not think differently. Let him think of her as he would. No, the years which had destroyed her youth and bloom had only given him a more glowing, manly, open look, in no respect lessening his personal advantages. She had seen the same Frederick Wentworth. So he comes back, he's looking good. He hasn't changed, he only looks better. And of course, now he's also rich. And she thinks that he is not attracted to her. Of course, it takes some time, maybe about 150 pages or so, but eventually she realizes that's not the case. The comedy for me comes on the next page when Wentworth says, talking to another friend. These are all social parties throughout the whole novel. Yes, here I am, Sophia, quite ready to make a foolish match, talking about getting married. Anybody between 15 and 30 may have me for asking. A little beauty and a few smiles and a few compliments to the Navy, and I am a lost man. Should not this be enough for a sailor who has had no society among women to make him nice? So Wentworth is saying, I just want to get married, and I'm looking for anyone who's 15, between the ages of 15 and 30. And of course, by the end of the novel, he ends up choosing the one who is just about 30. Certainly possible. It seems a little unlikely to me, but that's the work of fiction. The fiction's always dealing with the unlikely scenarios. So that's the premise. On top of that, we have critique of the upper classes. Anne comes from the upper class. Her father's a baron, and her sister just kind of hangs out with the father. They're both very into themselves, self-absorbed, full of flattery, love to get flattered, love to give it. And that was her father at the beginning who was talking about sailors. The backstory to this is the father, even though he has this title, he's not a successful man. He has kind of squandered his money. He lives beyond his means. His wife was able to keep him in line, but she has died. So now he has to give up this house, Kellinich, I think they call it. And they have to rent it out, but he doesn't want to rent it out to anyone, just anyone. And he certainly didn't really want to rent it out to a sailor. And he explains why, though he does end up renting it out to the sailor. He says here, right after he said the thing about not wanting a friend or being sorry if a friend belonged to this group of men. Yes, it is in 2 points offensive to me. So being a sailor, 2 points offensive. I have 2 strong grounds of objection to it. First, as being the means of bringing persons of obscure birth into undue distinction and raising men to honors which their fathers and grandfathers never dreamt of. And secondly, as it cuts up a man's youth and vigor most horribly, a sailor grows old sooner than any other man. I have observed it all my life. A man is in greater danger in the Navy of being insulted by the rise of one whose father his father might have disdained to speak to, and of becoming prematurely an object of disgust himself than in any other line. So in both counts, these are kind of pathetic reasons not to like the sailor. On one hand, he doesn't like it because it's kind of an equalizer. It allows the lower classes to gain what he calls undue distinction. But I think if you're going out there and you're working hard out on a ship and you get some distinction from there, you probably deserve it, especially compared to the Baron here, Sir Walter, as he just kind of sits back and spends money and goes to parties. And then the other reason why he doesn't like it is it makes your skin look bad, makes you older. And Walter is very vain. And not only does he want to look good himself, but he doesn't want to be around anyone who doesn't look good. Some interesting context for this, and this is the kind of the sociological perspective that I really enjoyed about this. In a footnote, it talks about how sailors and sailing was used as a form of education. So let me just read this footnote here. It says, Captain Wentworth, remember that's Anne's man by the end. Captain Wentworth's concern for Dick Musgrove's schooling seemed excessive to Dick himself, but it was also mandatory. Dick's this, not really important, but he ended up dying out at sea. The Navy employed schoolmasters, often the ship's chaplains, to provide education to all its midshipmen. The schoolmasters would instruct the youngsters, as they were known, in the mathematical and astronomical knowledge that was required for navigation in gunnery. After at least 6 years on a ship's muster, an apprenticeship period which a boy could begin as early as age 11, a midshipman would be examined in these topics and on his record. If he passed, he could be appointed lieutenant and begin his career as an officer, in which case he will be perhaps insulting, as Walter said, men whose fathers were above these people's fathers. In many ways, the fleet provided offshore boarding schools to the parents of this period, especially to those who were rich or well connected politically and whose recommendations would therefore have some weight with the Navy captains who could choose which boys they put on the ship's musters. So parents who were wealthy could send their children off as young as 11 to work on a ship. They call it almost like a floating boarding school. They would work on the ship. They would also get an education. And after 6 years, they pass an exam and they become lieutenants. In comparison to the rich today or the boarding school life today, this is extreme, right? This is quite a difference. I couldn't imagine any 11-year-olds that I know out on the seas, facing the kind of difficulties that they would there. So for me, that was quite interesting, and also, as I said, gives this context for why Sir Walter and his oldest daughter Elizabeth don't like or kind of are weary of sailors. I also think that Jane Austen, through Anne, her protagonist, is criticizing this. She's given us this depiction of Walter as kind of a buffoon, obviously way too self-absorbed. She's not celebrating this, I don't think, even though she's not outright criticizing it either. Shortly after this, this again gives us some insight into their the upper class. They meet when I'm talking about Sir Walter meets his new tenant, who's the admiral, who's a sailor. As it says here, each lady was previously well disposed for an agreement, and saw nothing therefore but good manners in the other. And with regard to the gentleman, there was such a hearty good humor, such an open, trusting liberality on the admiral's side, as could not but influence Sir Walter, who had besides been flattered into his very best and most polished behavior by Mr. Shepherd's assurances of his being known by report to the admiral as a model of good breeding. So they meet, they like each other, but it's all about the flattery. Walter is flattered that the admiral has heard of him and knows and believes he's of good breeding, and they're happy to see that each other has manners. There's a lot of talk here about how they would leave their cards at each other's house and then display them to show other people who had been visiting them. So it's very much a society of display and trying to show how rich you are and get the power from that, and certainly a consciousness of the classes. Though behind the scenes, they are criticizing each other. So a few paragraphs later, the admiral says that the baronet, Sir Walter, will never set the Thames on fire. He's never going to do anything great, which I thought was an interesting phrase that they used back in the 1800s, never going to set the Thames on fire. Another interesting one that comes later, not talking about the Baron, but talking about another character named Benwick, not that important, but they say he's rather too piano for me, which would mean he's too mild and weak. Piano meaning softly in Italian. And so I don't know if that came directly from the Italian or through the musical terms. If it is the latter, it shows that the music had a deeper place in our life back in the 1800s. So we get this two-sidedness of polite society. It's not quite as pronounced as you would get in Moliere's plays, and it doesn't have the same level of kind of depravity in these characters, which for me makes it a bit boring, but it's interesting nonetheless to see how stuffy these characters are and how they behave. All right, another scene that I thought I found interest in here was a comment on gender roles. I think Jane Austen is often held up as being maybe not a feminist, but I mean, she's a early female writer, so of course she's important to if we want to separate literature by gender. In this story here, we have a child. It's Charles and Mary Musgrove's child gets injured. He's sick. He's hurt, and Mary is upset because her husband's going to go out, but she has to stay with the kid. Right? She says here, so you and I, meaning you, me, Mary, and Anne, are to be left to shift by ourselves with this poor sick child and not a creature coming near us all the evening. Right? She needs to have people around her. That's the fun thing. I knew how it would be. This is always my luck. If there is anything disagreeable going on, men are always sure to get out of it. And Charles is as bad as any of them. Very unfeeling. So this is behind the scenes critique of kind of the privileged position that men get. They don't have to worry about the sick children. I must say it is very unfeeling of him to be running away from his poor little boy. Talks of his being going on so well. How does he know that he is going on well, or that there may not be a sudden change half an hour hence? I did not think Charles would have been so unfeeling. So she's upset about this. And then Anne's response in the next paragraph is, but that was only the effect of the suddenness of your alarm, of the shock. You will not be hysterical again. I dare say, this is a response because Mary's saying, I don't think I can handle being with the child either. I'm no better than my husband would be. And she says, I dare say we shall have nothing to distress us. I perfectly understand Mr. Robinson's directions and have no fears. And indeed, Mary, I cannot wonder at your husband. Nursing does not belong to a man. It is not his province. A sick child is always the mother's property. Her own feelings generally make it so. So Anne's view of this is the mother should be with, if there's a sick child, the mother needs to be there. If that's her property, because she's got the feelings for the child that the man doesn't have. Shortly after, though, Mary ends up pawning the child off to Anne. So Anne kind of watches her, and Mary gets to go out and have her fun. So, I'm not exactly sure. On one hand, this is a critique, I think, of the role, the privilege that men have. But on the other hand, we've got Anne, which in some ways is a stand-in for Jane Austen, saying that, hey, well, sick child, that's the job of a mother, which, I guess it would depend on what feminist period we're talking about, whether that would be considered feminist or not. Interestingly, Mary pawns her off, which is kind of the contemporary notion of if you can pay another woman to do it, pass the child on. It's kind of the Ponzi scheme of modern feminism, and that's how it ends. The last scene I'd like to look at here is near the end, page 122. Again, we're talking about society, what's considered good company. This is Anne talking with Mr. Elliot. This is a cousin who is a shady character who's trying to compete for Anne's hand and kind of forces some jealousy out of Wentworth. And this is what really kind of helps Anne and Wentworth get together. But in one interaction that Mr. Elliot and Anne have, Anne says, "My idea of good company, Mr. Elliot, is the company of clever, well-informed people who have a great deal of conversation. That is what I call good company." So she's kind of complaining about some of these people they're hanging out with as being kind of, uninteresting, not very clever. They've got the prestigious name, but they're dull. Mr. Elliot says, "You are mistaken," said he gently. "That is not good company. That is the best. Good company requires only birth, education, and manners, and with regard to education is not very nice. Birth and good manners are essential. But a little learning is by no means a dangerous thing in good company. On the contrary, it will do very well. So Mr. Eliot saying, no, good company is just you come from a good family. You've got that birth, you have some manners. You don't need to be clever and well-educated. You don't need to be a reader like Anne is. My cousin Anne shakes her head. She is not satisfied. She is fastidious. My dear cousin, sitting down by her, you have a better right to be fastidious than almost any other woman I know. But will it answer? Will it make you happy? Will it not be wiser to accept the society of these good ladies in Laura Place and enjoy all the advantages of the connection as far as possible? So in this regards, Mr. Eliot is acting as kind of the Fallant to Alceste in The Misanthrope. He's more level-headed in saying, listen, I know these people aren't that exciting, but if you don't engage with them, if you don't like them, you're not going to reap the benefits. And this also kind of lays out Mr. Eliot's hand, who we discover shortly after through a kind of a character that just kind of appears. Maybe this is a weakness in the narrative structure. But we find out that Mr. Eliot, the cousin, is really a self-seeker. He's trying to marry Anne just to get ahead. He's not a good guy. And this gives his hand away. He's saying, just enjoy these people. So, don't be so critical. Whereas Anne is more critical. And again, I think that's what makes her a more interesting character. So that's Jane Austen's Persuasion. It's not the fastest read, but as I said, it gives you some insight into life at the time, especially of the upper classes, though none of the kind of backdoor, more darker or nefarious activity that you might get in some other novels. Check it out. It's worth reading. Thank you for listening.